And this Hangout on Air is live. Welcome, everybody. This is I'm Brooke Lester, and this is OOTLE15 Google Hangout on Air. We've started the Pentateuch, and we're into Genesis 1 through 11. And this is in service to OOTLE15, the Open Old Testament or Hebrew Bible learning event, which you can find at OOTLE15.net. And we've got a full bullpen today. This is partly why we're late getting started. We're a few minutes late getting started because we were having fun in the green room. Dave Garber and Joe Scrivener and John Miller and myself. I've usually got this written down, but why don't I just let you all do it today? Real quick, let's welcome Joe first because we haven't seen him yet. Joe, where do you do what you do and what do you do?
Hello, I am Joe Scrivener. I teach in the Religion and Theology Department at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I'm also the pastor at Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church, which is at the back gate of the college.
All right. And John Miller, remind us about you.
I teach religion, biblical studies in Greek at McMurray University, which is a Methodist school or affiliated school in Abilene, Texas. And I'm here because Joe Scrivener helped me get through comprehensive exams.
Yep. Yeah, you're not the only one. And Dave, remind us where you are and what you do.
I'm Dave Garber. I teach Old Testament and Hebrew at the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University.
All right. Nisha Jr. is traveling today, so she's not with us, which is a shame because Nisha has waited so patiently through these episodes for us to get to the Pentateuch, and we're doing the first Pentateuch episode on a day when she's traveling. But we look forward to hopefully having Nisha back next week as we get into the ancestral stories. When we were talking beforehand, I threatened a little bit, and this is still something that could happen. There's another Star Wars trailer out. There's a lot of like kind of like little news coming out. Daredevil's been out for at least a couple of weeks now. There's just kind of some odd little news events happening among the Marvel Cinematic Universe and its cast. And certainly I don't know about the other two of you. Dave and I both really like comics. And cinematic science fiction, so this and fantasy. So it's a little dangerous. We're gonna really try to stay on Pentateuch.
I don't know about you, but all of that just sounded like the adults in a Charlie Brown episode to me.
No, I comprehended it. Do you all recommend Daredevil?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I don't know about Brooke, but I do. And there's a lot of interesting theological stuff in there.
There is a lot of good stuff going on out there about Dave
put it on his expense account for his department, and he's just trying to justify that now.
This month's Netflix is going on my taxes for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I polished off the first. They released the whole first season of Daredevil all at once, and almost right away you started seeing articles. The Slate article comes to mind, but there were others talking about the Roman Catholicism of Matt Murdock, who's the alter ego of Daredevil, and which was true for some I don't know if versions is the right word, but some period of his comic book reality. And I think, although that's before my time in the comics, I've heard it said that when Daredevil stopped being kind of silly with the yellow and brown costume and sort of kind of a Peter Parker-y kind of just joking all the time kind of persona. When he began to have some real gravitas in the series, part of how that happened was by making use of his religion and of his Roman Catholicism. And having heard that, I think it's interesting how much the Netflix Marvel project on Daredevil has really right away in the opening credits, right? Where you've got these scenes from Hell's Kitchen sort of taking shape, and one of the prominent ones is his church, with the statuary outside of it.
And I think his priest is one of the most well represented or well portrayed members of clergy that I've seen in a long time on television, which is I think a good thing. Yeah.
I think that's interesting to me because you're not the first person I've heard say that about that character. And on the one hand, I can draw some easy contrast with like kind of the silly or cumbersome or really two-dimensional, like the guy in Contact comes to mind, right? Jodie Foster, Matt McConaughey in Contact, where he just kind of stands in as the sort of clumsy, useless, ineffective representative of the church who can only, this really ties into what we had done previously with like lament psalms, complaint psalms, complaint in the Hebrew Bible. The only way he can really respond to tragedy in a person's life is to intone that some things are just God's will. No wonder the Jodie Foster character leaves religion behind. Who wouldn't with a representative like that? I kind of thought when I saw this priest, who he reminded me a little bit of was De Niro. Not exactly, but De Niro in what is it? Sleepers. Kevin Bacon and these guys, where he's just kind of a. I think that is Hell. Does that take place? Sleepers takes place in Hell's Kitchen, doesn't it? At least the neighborhood. I think it is Hell's Kitchen. And he is that kind of urban, gritty, in the know. Kind of priest, which I liked in Sleepers, and I like it also in Daredevil. Is that the kind of thing you're describing, Dave?
Yeah, a little bit. But have you finished the series?
Yeah.
Yeah. But they have an interesting conversation about Job in one of the later episodes, and Hasatan and all of that. So I thought it was kind of interesting. But
yeah, I knew something like that must be coming because I started getting lots of people trying not to do spoilers on my Facebook, saying, "Are you watching Daredevil? Have you gotten to a certain episode where certain kind of you'll know when you get there?" Yeah. So
tell them to send you a message.
Yeah, right. So Pentateuch. I was telling these folks before we came on, I mean, my students know that I teach the Hebrew Bible wrong by ending with the Pentateuch. A big part of my...
Just stop there, right, Brooke?
Just full stop after the word wrong.
I just teach it wrong, right?
Teach it wrong. Where should we begin? But I like doing the Pentateuch last. I've got some really like super pedagogical reasons that I can write about and sort of justify the choice. But I don't mind saying that part of it is that I just really prefer the conversations that, as an instructor and a participant, I prefer the kinds of conversations we're able to have about the Pentateuch when students have already sort of gotten used to the materials and methods of biblical studies. It's daunting, isn't it? I mean, when it's the first week of school and you've probably got if for seminary in our context, you've got first semester students acclimate, trying to figure out what this whole thing is all about. And we say, okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is how Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. And even if you are someone for whom that's not going to be a major adjustment and entail a lot of conversations and platforms under platforms that sort of have to be dealt with, by the way, you're going to have to learn like 1,000 years of geopolitical history of the ancient Near East in order even to slot, these characters, these sources where they belong. Welcome to the first week of class. And I'm
still waiting on the problem, bro.
What's that?
I'm still waiting on the problem there.
So no, I mean you joke, Joe, but we've talked about this. A lot of people, Joe and I have been teaching fellows together, and we've known each other for a long time. What's your experience on that, Joe? The reason I asked you especially, Joe, is because you are one of my colleagues who I count on as being someone who is really more gifted at being sensitive about that and more practiced at being sensitive about that than I am. So I really am interested. I do care about what you have to say about it.
My students don't think as highly of me as you do. That's the first thing. But I start with Rakia, actually. I start with the cosmology of Genesis 1. That's where I start. Before we get into authorship or anything like that, the first thing I want them to become aware of is the historical distance in the perception of the world and the perception of the planet and space and the earth and so forth that we see in Genesis 1 versus what we now know through modern science, modern knowledge.
Tell us, I mean, a lot of people know, but a lot of people won't. What is the rakia, and what are some of these? When you talk about it being a different world, like how, what's different about the world that the readers and hearers of Genesis 1, right, we're talking about, are walking around in?
Well, my first assignment is for them to draw Genesis 1 as they read it, especially verses 1 through 19, which I think is the first 4 days. And so I want them to draw it. That's their homework assignment. And inevitably, when we come back to class, they will not put the water where it should be. They will not draw a dome, even if they're reading the NRSV, which clearly has the word dome, the English word translating the Hebrew word rakia. They will read that there's water above it and water beneath it, and they will not represent that because they don't understand what that means. It does not look like or sound like what they learned in earth science class in middle school. And so that's the first assignment that makes them read the text closely, and it helps me make them aware of their assumptions about the text and the ideas of the writer of the text. So long story short, there's a snow dome, right, a snow globe in Genesis 1. There's a saucer and a Tupperware bowl on top. And they need to know that's the world of Genesis 1. That's not the world that they see in pictures of the earth from outer space. I can't hear you, Brooke. You muted yourself or me or something.
So let's see.
Okay.
I'm going to do a screen share real quick, and you'll tell me that this is what we're talking about. But I got it here. It is screen share. So I know we've done this before. Okay, so it wants me to select a window and start the screen share.
Yes.
All right, so you guys see what we're talking about here, right? Did I lose it?
You did.
I think it's when, well, anyway, it's up for me now.
You might need for me to be talking, so like maybe if you guys are like muted, and make sure that you don't cut in well, just for the moment that I'm showing it. So so there's this rakia, this firmament, this dome on the top, right? And there's us among the trees and the birds. There's you in the middle there, right? And there's this picture, and like there's this, and you said it, you described it well already, Joe, and you say it really well, that like if you're the writer or the hearers of Genesis 1, this is the world you're walking around in. This is the world you see and feel around you all the time, and that you're describing. And this is the world that's created in these initial days of creation. Is that right?
That's right. And honestly, Brooke, I don't know how you proceed in Old Testament without starting here. I just don't know how you do it.
Wrong.
No, I mean,
did you hear wrong?
I'm kidding, of course, but for my students who come from a Christian context, most of them or many of them, it forces them, it starts the conversation immediately on their assumptions about inspiration, on their assumptions about historical distance. I will draw a long line on the board and put Genesis 1 far on the left and 2015 way down on the right, and check, and put Copernicus and Galileo somewhere in the middle, and get them to think about, okay, what do you think ancient people thought about the world? What are you seeing here in Genesis 1? And how does that help you rethink what you assume about the Bible, about the time in which the Bible was written? If you believe certain things about God in the Bible, how does this help you check your assumptions about those things? So the joke with me in my class is that I never got out of Genesis 1.
I like that. Not ever get out of Genesis 1. There's a joke. I mean, there's kind of a. I don't know if this happened to other people, but when I took Introduction to the Old Testament, we actually started on a bunch of Sumerian stuff. But once we started in the Bible, I mean, we were 8 or 9 weeks into a 12-week class, and we were still in the book of Exodus, at that time. And that's not really atypical, is it? I've got a colleague who quite consciously, with full intent, really does spend way most, like over, more than 50%, and then like even like some more than 50% on certainly the Pentateuch, and a huge amount of that on the book of Genesis. And I think that makes sense. And part of what I hear there is that task of defamiliarization. That for you, Joe, a big part of what you want to be grabbing onto and defamiliarizing is worldview, literally worldview. Like literally the physical worldview, to say these guys are walking around in a physically completely different world than we are. I think that's one of the reasons I like starting with the writings for me, is that what I'm defamiliarizing there is their concept of Bible in some ways, because it's really easy in the writings to find these conflicting, contrasting, competing perspectives on God in the praise psalms versus the complaint psalms, or in Proverbs versus the dissenting wisdom, Kohelet and Job, and so for me, what I'm grabbing onto and seeking to like defamiliarize is this idea of Bible that they have versus what the Bible turns out to be when you start turning its pages. Dave, I think you weren't here one week. And tell me, actually, Dave, there's something, Dave, that I use of yours, and I think I've told you that I use it, and I actually don't know much about its origins for you. I just ganked it off you on Facebook. And,
if it's good, then I'll claim it.
All right, so what it is I call it Dave Garber's List, and it's 6 things about the Bible. 1 thing about seminary and 5 things about the Bible. And so, like, number 1 is seminary is not Sunday school. And number 2, the Bible is for mature audiences. I think I usually paraphrase it as the Bible is for grown-ups. So you look at like the children's picture of Noah's Ark versus, kind of seeing all the bodies and whatnot. And this is the one I was thinking of, Dave, and this is often one that I go to, as your number 3. The Bible is not a Bible, in quotes and things. So when you see things like the Mac Bible, like what do we mean when a book is published as the Mac Bible or the Juicing Bible or the, whatever, but the Paleo Diet Bible or something? And it's like, this is going to be the book that is a comprehensive book that tells you everything you need to know about this thing, and sort of in a prescriptivist vein tells you what to do with this knowledge,
Right.
And I like that idea, that idea of deconstruct. I guess it's not deconstructing Derrida. I don't even know what deconstruction is, but I can lecture on it, but that doesn't mean I know what it is.
Defamiliarization.
But defamiliarization, right? Defamiliarizing this, they've got this idea. Students will often have this idea of what the Bible is. It's the Bible, and seeing that these disagreements and competing perspectives, and especially things like complaint against God. That's why that's the starting place for me. I want to hear. John, how much this has to be. I mean, in New Testament, right? I've joked with you before, John. In fact, even like while we were getting ready to start here, is like, when my students are especially upset about things they're learning in the Old Testament, a part of my answer is, wait till you get to the New Testament, because we'll get it just makes me really miss my New Testament and my Jesus and my New Testament and everything. It's like, okay, well, have you taken New Testament?
Tell them what you actually say, Brooke. Wait till you see what they do to Jesus next semester. That's what you've been telling people since you were a graduate student instructor at Princeton Seminary, and I'm sure you still tell them that now.
I do still tell them that, and I have a running thing with one of our New Testament instructors where, it's really important to him that the students mostly take Old Testament before New Testament, and I like to turn the tables on him on that and say, I'd like to see 50% of our students taking New Testament before Old Testament, because why should I be the one to break the bad news to everybody?
You don't relish.
So
this
what's that?
book?
What's that?
You don't relish this role?
You got to break some bad. If you want to make an omelet, you got to break eggs. And if you want to proclaim the good news in the Hebrew Bible, you first have to break the bad news about the Hebrew Bible. But what's it like is it similar on the New Testament side? Is it exactly the same? And what's the shape of it? Like with Old Testament, they get whacked with JEDP right at the outset. Is there anything? Is it similar with the Gospels or not so much? What happens?
That's a good question. I think that. I mean, the simple, basic answer is yes. It's just as bad on the New Testament side of things. I think that what's more difficult for most seminary students in the kind of normal curricular progression that you're talking about, where everybody starts, in some cases, I think at PTS when I started my MDiv, I think OT 101 was the very first class anybody ever attended at whatever 8 or 9 o'clock, Monday morning. And to have that literal first experience of your graduate theological education be almost the first words out of Pat Miller's mouth. Moses didn't write this, and we're just going to roll from there. Yeah, I think it's much more difficult for students because it's the first time that they're dealing with that. Of course, I'm more acquainted now with the context that's similar to what Joe's describing. I don't. Our students don't necessarily do both Old Testament and New Testament, so they can basically take either one. It fulfills the general education requirement. There's no reason for me to think when I walk into a classroom that my students have ever had any introduction at all to academic biblical studies. So in that sense, I find myself pretty much in that same situation. I'm the one who's breaking the eggs. I'm the one who's breaking the bad news to them. And it's, I mean, you can't, when one of the first things I do in an Introduction to New Testament class is kind of give them a sort of introduction to exegesis, and we sit down and I have them read the first part of Luke chapter 2, so the Christmas story, because everybody, even the unchurched folks, are going to be familiar with that. And then we start talking about, I ask them to kind of, pull out any question that that this reading brings up for them, and I kind of categorize them broadly as historical questions, theological questions, literary questions, and as we go through those questions, one of the components of the process is to say, sometimes these questions are going to lead you into some research that's going to help you understand this better. But sometimes, like with Luke 2, especially the beginning of Luke 2, when you start looking at that historically and you start looking up, who is Quirinius? Who is Augustus? When are these people, when are they flourishing in the Roman Empire? And you start realizing that, hold it, what this guy told me in Luke chapter 1 was that this all happens in the time of King Herod, who dies in 4 BCE. And now you're saying he's born in the time of Quirinius, who was governor in 6 CE, right? And so I asked my students, any nursing students here, anybody who knows anything about human gestation, how long is human gestation? 9 months. Wow, 10 years. Jesus comes out needing to shave and wanting to smoke. And so, yeah, it's much the same. A long way of saying yes, I agree.
I like that, Jesus. I like Jesus in the manger, need to shave and wanting to smoke.
You're the only one.
Sure.
I'm getting images of a Stewie Jesus.
Stewie Jesus. If there's any really good Photoshoppers out there following on Twitter,
do some other project. Don't Photoshop that.
Don't do Stewie Jesus.
You can just see, the Madonna and Child, and somebody drawn in some 5 o'clock shadow and a cig. Yeah, no, don't do that.
Yeah. What else? I mean,
I've silenced Brooke. Victoria.
I'm not going to be able to get past Stewie Jesus for a while. I'm just sure. I don't know what's going to happen next.
Sorry to derail us there. Oh, I would want to say something about. I tried moving the creation material later in the semester once, and it just didn't feel right to me. And the reason it didn't, maybe it's just because I was set in my ways or whatnot. But I think part of it was because it was it's such a huge question, I think, or debate that has kind of dominated in the South, and could have, in my context, being kind of a Baptist context, that it's really hard not to immediately go there. But what I try to do is I try to do it more where they discover the differences on their own. So I split the class into groups, and I say, okay, look at the character of God in Genesis 1. I give, I 6 groups, and I'll say to groups 1 through 3, you're looking at Genesis 1, and the other groups, you're looking at Genesis 2. And I get them to describe the character of God, to describe the character of the humans, to describe the order of creation, and that kind of thing. And then we just kind of list everything up that they observe on the board, and we just compare and contrast. And then ultimately I'll ask the question, okay, what does this mean? And they'll say, well, we got 2 different creation stories. So it's coming from them and not me up there just kind of bursting bubbles right away. That's in a way that's kind of totalitarian or anything like that. So, but I think because it's such a huge question, now what I've noticed in the past, even 13, 14 years of teaching it, is that the surprise of, oh, there are 2 creation stories is lessening. It's getting less and less and less. And I don't know if that means that biblical literacy is up necessarily, or that there's a different trend in the student profiles. I don't know how to interpret that necessarily, but the idea of 2 creation stories is becoming more commonplace in today's students than even students 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, there's a conversation we have here at Garrett Evangelical in recent years about whether students are coming in knowing less Bible, and because I see the same thing. I mean, we've been teaching about as long, and it's hard to it's hard to isolate whether maybe are we going after a slightly different pool of students? Has there anything changed in United Methodism? Da 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 da. I mean, it's hard to there's a lot of X, Y, and Z factors. But the question, when I hear from faculty colleagues that their impression generally is that students are coming in with less what they usually would describe as formation. Students are coming in not already formed in the Bible story, and I always want to hasten to pluralize that and say, well, the Bible stories. But I think that for me is part of what's encouraging. That is, to the extent that learners are coming in formed in a single Bible story, which is to say, which is often what that means is they're formed in a lot of ideas about the Bible. They're formed in a lot of maybe homily on the Bible. Maybe even the memorization of verses, for prizes or whatever. But that to me is, I mean, you use the term biblical literacy, Dave, and it's like I hear both of us saying like that's not what we would call biblical literacy. In that, that is, you might know a lot of Bible, but that's not the same as being literate in Bible, or maybe I mean biblical studies, but or literate about the Bible, But I do find that if it's the case that more and more students are coming, and I've said something like this before, I'm sure here, where if students are coming in not being as familiar with the Bible, that doesn't bother me because they can read the Bible. The Bible is not as long as the 7 Harry Potter books put together, not even by far, as far as I don't think, But they can read the Bible. It's not, you can read the Bible. It's not that hard. It's not that hard to read it. But to the extent that learners do or do not have some pretty good liberal arts background, if a student has had a pretty good history class and can remember it, if they've had a pretty good literature class, if they've studied Hemingway or Fitzgerald or Chaucer or Shakespeare or Homer or whoever, and they remember what that was like, then once we can sort of click that switch that says, yes, we actually want you to do these things that you did in those classes with this material, I feel like a learner is going to be in a lot better shape. And I wonder if that's part of what we see when we see more and more learners who are not freaking out about, who are, actually I shouldn't say, I don't mean that derisively, but who are not poleaxed in the sternum, by the things they learned in the first weeks of a biblical studies class, it's that thing of if the secular learners and the church learners are sort of kind of are a little closer to each other culturally than they used to be. I'm not sure that's all bad. At least in my experience, I'm not sure that's all bad. Except insofar as it can leave the learners who are sort of poleaxed by this stuff maybe more marginalized or feeling themselves even more on the sidelines than they felt before.
Yeah, I think you're right.
What about Genesis 1 through 11? We haven't. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff in there. I never know what. I always feel like we could just grab onto any one weird thing in Genesis 1 through 11 and sort of just start going crazy with it. John, you reminded me that, and I'm the person whose research area is allusion in the Bible. But I didn't know what you meant right away when you talked about Genesis and Acts, and you had to remind me about it when we were talking before. And that's the Pentecost story, right? And you were talking about the Tower of Babel, yeah?
Actually, Dave was referencing that material,
Was that
and
Dave?
that's yeah. I was actually making a quip about it's not in Genesis 1 through 11, but the language that that Luke uses when he's describing Zechariah's experience with Gabriel is a direct allusion to the later story of Abram. That is when Gabriel tells Zechariah, all the stuff that's going to happen, he says "katakti nosomai," and that's a direct allusion to Genesis 15, right, where Abram is God's promising Abram, that you're going to have progeny, and Abram asks in the LXX, he asks "katakti nosomai." It's such bad Greek. I actually did a TLG search on this. It doesn't exist anywhere in the corpus of Greek literature except in Genesis, Luke 1, and quotations of either of those passages in the Church Fathers. So there's no question that the author of Luke and Acts is kind of, well versed in the Septuagintal text of Genesis. Again, another long answer to what was supposed to be an easy question. Yeah.
No, it is. It's interesting. I mean, especially that. That in that instance, it's like Genesis 12 and forward. If we're getting into the ancestral narratives there, although Genesis 1 through 11 does come up in the New Testament, which in some way it's not a surprise, but what it stands in contrast to the actual Old Testament, to the Hebrew Bible, where the whole rest of the Hebrew Bible either doesn't seem to, pretty much the whole Hebrew Bible, just about the whole Hebrew Bible, either doesn't know about Genesis 1 through 11 or doesn't care much about Genesis 1 through 11. I mean, there's a little bit in there. Yeah, there's some late stuff. I know that takes a lot of folks by surprise because we treat it as so important. But part of where it begins to be treated important is certainly in the New Testament. With certainly Paul is going to be all over Adam, and everything like that.
Right. Yeah.
I can remember. What's that?
No, go ahead.
I was one of those kids who sort of. Did anyone ever do that thing where you wanted to read the Bible because it just looked really important and was read at church and stuff like that? And when I was like a kid, I was like, I don't even know how old. And some of my earliest recollection of reading the Bible was reading the story of Cain and Abel. And it was because we would go to church, and I was aware that what was being read at church was the Bible, and I'd come home, and we had this secretary with a glass door on it, and in there was my mom's family Bible, and it was this big old King James version, and everything, and I just loved it because it was big and old, it was big and old, and I had to use a key to open the secretary door, and pull this thing out and lay it open. So I'd want to read the Bible, and of course I would start with Genesis 1 and 2 and read through it. And you get tired, I was just a boy, and so I usually couldn't read much further than Genesis 4, but Genesis 5 genealogies are kicking in, and it's boring and sequel. So I must have read Genesis 1 through 4 a dozen times at least, in a relatively small period when I was young and curious about this stuff. And
no wonder you're so messed up, Brooke.
Well, that's just the beginning. I mean, I've said before, except for that episode with Genesis 1 through 4 over and over, I would have to say probably Lord of the Rings was more like my first canon before the Hebrew Bible became canon for me. But
How are you? How are you and your brother getting along when you were reading this?
I was going to say,
like
for,
anything,
for the
brothers.
for the listeners who don't understand, Brooke is a twin. So the Cain and Abel story, this had to not play well at all in the Lester household.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. We were fraternal. We are fraternal twins, and like a lot of twins, like a lot of boys, and any other kids, we fist. I mean, at this, we must have been fist fighting every single day of our lives. Like, I mean, when I remember my childhood, I remember this was just sort of how we played. Was just we'd get mad about nothing and fist fight with one another, then go to our separate corners of this big house that we grew up in until we got mad about something else, bored and mad about something else, we'd fist fight again. So yeah, maybe Genesis 4 spoke to me for more than one reason. And I can remember that image of where God says to Cain, "What have you done? Your brother's blood calls to me from the soil, from the ground," or something like that. And I can remember, I think of this sometimes with regard to like first naivete, and critical distancing, and then second naivete. I didn't know about metaphors at that time. I was young enough, I didn't know what a metaphor was. And so I imagined that Abel's blood was literally, how else, calling. And I had this mental picture of like this, like kind of a cartoon of like blood in the ground with like eyes and a mouth shaped like an O, calling, and God hears it,
Sounds like South Park.
What's that?
Sounds like South Park.
It does sound a little South Parkian, and I guess it kind of looks like it in my head, but it had a kind of pathos to it. It really spoke to me, and later when we talk about the Yahwist. The Yahwist writes about God in anthropomorphic terms. It's like this was really anthropomorphic. That anthropomorphism really worked on me, where God was someone who has ears that can hear a literal voice calling from the ground, and then wants to know what's up and goes to a person to find out what gives. That's my earliest God. So the Yahwist, I don't know. Maybe it's good that the Yahwist got a hold of me before the Deuteronomist did, because I tend to be pretty critical of the Deuteronomist. But do other people not have this? What are you? I'm actually curious. Like, do people remember? Do you remember? Like, how did you learn about Genesis and the creation stories? Was it culturally? Was it from the Bible? And what impressions did it make on you? Do you have any recollection of that, or no?
Yeah, most of it was from Sunday school. Children's Bibles and those kinds of things. And I think the story that left the most impressions on me was the flood story. And it may just be because we had the precious moments, Noah's Ark stuff all over the house, or but we talked about it a lot, and the rainbow story and all of that kind of stuff. But that tends to be something that my tradition emphasized a lot. So,
what about you, Joe?
Yeah, maybe the Noah story with the pictures. Growing up watching Ten Commandments every Easter on ABC probably drew me to the Exodus story some. There's a grand movie I watched, every year, and so maybe but that takes us, outside of this beginning section. Maybe middle school, I've become somewhat familiar with some of the arguments about the Bible and science, a little bit, and but mainly just Sunday school, vacation Bible school, church, that sort of thing. Early stories.
Brooke, I remember. I don't remember how old I was, but I think all of you guys know. I grew up in a very fundamentalist background. And so reading the Bible was, very important, obviously. And I remember at a certain point, my mother getting these. It was the Bible basically kind of published in a way that was these little, I don't know, half-inch thick, ring-bound kind of the Bible in however many parts it took to have it, in these little kind of more easily, easy to carry around, easy to whatever, large print. And the idea was you were supposed to go through like one of these a month. I think they divided it into 12, and so you were supposed to get through the Bible in a year. And so I remember, reading through this stuff, and then I remember reading it again a few years later and thinking, how did I miss this stuff in Genesis where Abram and Sarai are related, right? The whole half-sister, half-brother thing, because that still creeps me out. And apparently, when I was young, I just read this stuff, and it didn't even, didn't have any effect on me. I didn't think about that. I don't even want to talk about Judges 19. I somehow just completely blocked all that out. So yeah, that's kind of my recollection of early Bible reading, is more a recollection from the more recent past, and realizing how I had just completely missed all of these problems that would later be much more challenging as a reader and as an interpreter.
I'm answering this while I try to get to where I can show you. Oh, I'm not going to try to do two things at once. We've got a Stewie Jesus in the Twitter feed, but it's given me a hard time about screen sharing from.
That's
from
probably
Twitter,
God's will. That's God's will. Don't screen share Stewie Jesus.
Don't screen share Stewie Jesus. Take a look at hashtag OOTLE15. On Twitter at this moment. You'll be able to see it. You'll be able to see it. For the curious, this one-time only offer. Those of you watching this and recording later, it's going to be, I don't think you're going to be able to manage it. So it's your bonus for being here now, is you can go to Twitter right now, it's OOTLE15, and see Stewie Jesus. When you say that's ideological criticism, isn't it? Right? When you say that, like, and this is what scares the daylights out of right-thinking biblical scholars everywhere, is that this is first naivete. When you read Genesis and a concubine, Judges. When you read Judges and a concubine is cut into 12 pieces after being turned over for gang rape to a mob, well, that's just normal, right? If you read that early enough, before you have achieved a certain kind of sophistication that prepares you for that critical distancing, what you're reading about is just the world, right? Yeah. What you're reading about is just the world, and ideological criticism. All my shorthands are really misunderstandings, and so my shorthand of ideological criticism is texts. Texts reproduce the worldviews in which they take shape, but texts also seek to reproduce in hearers the worldview in which they take shape, right? Through their rhetorical devices. It's like a virus, like DNA, and that's it, isn't it? Right? For me, my earliest readings in the Bible about what God is this anthropomorphic God who has ears and hears things, and this kind of like cartoon world of blood calling from the ground. And oh, by the way, this also includes, if you keep reading, right, to chapter 19 or so, men who turn their daughters over to mobs for rape, right, to protect men, and so on. And it's just the world, right? It's just the world.
Yeah.
Question, Brooke.
Yeah.
Does anyone use Genesis 6, 1 through 4 as an intro to the divine council idea in the Hebrew Bible?
It's a super good question, because we have a question in Twitter about Genesis 6 to 1 through 4, by the way, just asking us to kind of give it a nod and take a look at it. John, yeah?
I use that in my lecture on apocalyptic. So I have them read the portion about Enoch being, hoovered up into heaven while he's still alive in Genesis 5, and then we move into that passage in Genesis 6. And actually, what I'm doing with that is trying to get them to see the difference in how close God is in those events. God is angry, God is doing this, God is doing that, God is going to, basically cleanse the world, and then look at 1 Enoch, where you see, basically an expansion of the Genesis 6 narrative, and what later interpreters thought about these sons of God, and what all this was. So I don't think this necessarily answers the question you were asking, but yeah, I do. That's one of the few Old Testament passages that I do have my intro New Testament class read.
So John, just curious, what did you think of the Noah film?
I just saw it this week, by the
way. I have not seen it.
Oh, okay.
I need to see it.
Yes, you do, John.
It just came
That's
available.
That's a heavy word, Joe.
Shame on you, John.
Okay, and Joe, I gave you credit for helping me get through comps at the very beginning. Now you're going to drop this heavy word on me.
Because I used to say things like, "You should know this, John." That's what I used to say.
Joe, yes, you need to use your Darth Vader voice when you're issuing ultimatums like that.
That's right. Not impressive, John.
I thought he did.
No, I did not see Noah when it was in the theaters, because there's just some things I'm not going to do, and even though I get paid to do this kind of thing, but Noah just came out on Netflix pretty recently, and so it's available now. So I saw it this week So you've got, like, just in case we're skipping along a little bit fast for maybe some folks, right? Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is kind of a crazy little piece of narrative there that involves the sons of the gods coming down and taking human wives. And is that where we get the Nephilim for the first time, isn't it? Yeah, it's the Nephilim, right? And their children were the Nephilim who walked the land, and they were giants and whatnot. And folks, John, you mentioned First Enoch. I think Jubilees, the Book of Jubilees, do I remember rightly that the Book of Jubilees is also one of these trying to explain weird parts of the Hebrew Bible, at least in parts of it?
Yeah.
So folks can look for that. I mean, that was one nice thing about being in the internet age is people talk about these non-canonical extra-biblical stuff as if they were hidden away in, like, the basement of the Vatican somewhere, but they've always been available in your public library alongside of the Gospel of Thomas, and things like this. It's there somewhere. But now, so if you do a search for First Enoch, if you do a search, 1 Enoch, that's Enoch. If you do, like, Book of Jubilees and stuff, you'll see this, and it always gives me it always heartens me to see that ancient people also read Genesis 6, 1 through 4, for example, and said, what the hell? Like, what is this? Like, what just happened here? I'm so confused. And then tried to explain it, right? And then wrote narratives
those may be the most exciting 4 verses in the entire Bible.
They're super exciting. Well, they're not as exciting to me, for my money, as when God inexplicably decides to assassinate Moses moments after Moses has acquiesced and said, "Yes, God, I will do exactly what you have asked me to do. Here I go." And God's response is to leap out from behind the rocks and try to kill him. And then Moses' wife Zipporah, thinking quickly, right, like a superhero, quickly circumcises the child, and takes the bloody foreskin and rubs it on Moses' genitals. And God, sort of like Swiper the Fox in Dora, kind of like snaps his fingers and goes, "Oh, man," and sort of fades from the scene, foiled in his attempt to assassinate Moses. That's weirder than Genesis 6, 1 through 4, any day of the week.
This may be more a bad indication of my own character, but I always saw that as, you've had a hard day. God has had a hard day with Moses. I mean, seriously? Has a bush burning, not being consumed, has this whole, and you just get this, it just builds and builds, and finally, Moses saying, "Oh, I can't do this. No, I can't do that, God." And finally, God just saying, "All right, I see your brother over there. Can he talk?" And just getting livid with Moses, and you can just see God goes out for a beer after this long, hard day. You can't recruit somebody to come deliver his people. He's sitting there and he's just getting more and more upset as he plays it over his mind. Finally just decides, you know what? Tack with it. I'm going to go out and kill this guy. I mean, that's what that Exodus 4 passage looks like to me. Yeah, and talk about one that nobody's ever seen in Sunday school. That's what we should do. You should have a show devoted to the top 10 biblical scenes that no one's ever heard of because they're just that disturbing.
Scenes that have never been in Sunday school and never will. Right?
That's right.
Might as well say we're not even going to put them there. But no, in Noah, I'd heard about Noah that you had the Watchers, that the Watchers were going to take a role, right? Fans of the book of Daniel can get a glimpse of the Watchers in Daniel chapter 4. Enoch gets a lot of stuff done with the Watchers. My wife Michelle came in when I was about 20 minutes into the movie Noah, and her only question about the book of Noah was, on what day of creation did God create Transformers?
Yep. So
the Watchers, right? Rock Transformers.
So I was teaching a class, an Intro to Bible, at the Lee Arundel prison, and we set aside a day to watch the Noah film, and I am taking the stuff through, and the security has to check everything. And we had cleared the movie through the chaplain's office and done all of that. But the security officer looked at it and said, "I'm not sure you could take this in there." And I said, "Well, it's for a biblical studies class. We're looking at the Genesis text and in comparison to the movie." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't remember any rock giants being in the Bible."
Yeah. Well, now I've got to see this. Oh, I can't believe I've missed it.
I kept wanting to see. I kept wanting to see. Is it Boromir or Aragorn? I think it's Aragorn in Fellowship of the Ring. They have a cave troll. Remember that one scene? I kept hearing him say that when I was looking at the rock Transformers in the Noah movie.
The Noah movie also portrays the death really well. The mass dying. It really portrays it in a powerful way.
And it's interesting to think of it in terms of history of reception, because some of the scenes, I think, are cinematic replicas of Gustave Doré's drawings. And so I found that kind of fascinating, that it's pulling from not just the apocryphal traditions and the Enoch stuff, but it's pulling from a whole history of interpretation and smushing it into these 2.5 hours.
Wait, now whose drawings now?
Gustave Doré's line drawings of the flood, which is I don't know if you picked up my list of things about the Bible from the video that I did, but that was one of the things, comparing the illustrations of the flood in children's books to the illustrations of the flood by Gustave Doré.
That's right. That was part of the Bible is for mature audiences only.
Dave, can you link this to the Twitter feed or something?
Link the Gustave Doré stuff?
Yes.
What am I looking for whenever... Actually, go ahead and settle for me. Whenever I do your list of 6, Dave, is there anything that you have publicly available somewhere that I can cite as a context for this, or no?
I honestly don't know where you got it, unless it was from a Facebook feed. But I think there is a video that we did at McAfee, a list sessions from each of our faculty members on what it's like to teach in a seminary, or what it's like to be a seminary student. And so my session was reading the Bible as a seminarian, and these were broadcast on the Atlanta Interfaith Broadcast Network. So AIB, they may have that still out online somewhere, where you can see that whole presentation.
I'll try to remember to shoot you a note. Maybe I don't mind trying to do a little bit of Google searching on that. Maybe if I can ask you for pointers or anything like that, because that'd be a nice thing to get into the show notes on this somewhere. All right. What else? Anything else that we want to do with Genesis 1 through 11? I'm looking at our Twitter feed. It was Boromir. Was it Boromir? It was Boromir. Yeah. Okay.
So did you all tell me whether you do anything with Divine Council with?
Oh, that was your question. Why would we honor a perfectly good question by answering it, Joe?
Yeah, does anyone? That's why I try to. That's why I introduced the divine counsel idea. So that's why I never get out of Genesis. See, if you do
Yeah. There's just too much there.
cosmology, you do the authorship, you do Sons of God. Sons of God takes a couple of days at least.
Well, I'll tell you, Joe. Let me do a quick. Some of my own learners this week have a choice of 2 homework assignments that they can be doing, and one of them involves the divine counsel. And I gave them a set of. I'm not muted right now, am I?
No.
Okay, good. I gave them a set of texts. I know that wasn't one of them. But I did say that in Genesis 1 through 11, God occasionally addresses, the first person plural, we or us, and I gave him the usual suspects. Yeah, 1 Kings 22 with Micaiah and the divine counsel, Psalm 82, and some Job stuff, a couple of the Psalms. I didn't think about 6 1 through 4. You know what else I didn't think about on getting on the divine counsel? There was Isaiah 6, obviously, right, with the seraphim and so on.
And another thing is the NIV of Psalm 82 puts God's in quotes, so it's helpful for them to compare when you use the Psalms for information to help you understand what's going on in Genesis 6 1 through 4, to see how translations deal with God's in the plural in the Psalms, and it's really interesting to compare the NRSV, the NIV, the ESV.
And in the law, right? There's that one law. I want to say it's somewhere in the Mishpatim or whatever in Exodus where if a person is suspected of a certain crime, they are brought before the Elohim, and it's determined whether they did this thing or not. And as you know, biblical studies will be very comfortable saying this is part of the polytheism of pre-exilic Israel. Where God shares the cosmos with a host of divine beings. For most of the Hebrew Bible, right, God being the head, that being at the top of the heap, and the king of the mountain, but the Bible being very, for the most part, the Bible and certainly pre-exilic Israelite religion being very comfortable with all these other divine beings, right, either part of the divine council and other gods and so on and so on. But a lot of the interpreters, it's really the Bible's fault, right? Because by the time you get into the final editings of the Bible, they're not comfortable with it either, right? And you have that very strongly asserted monotheism of the exilic period and later, and so you'll still see. I mean, you'll still see you'll still see scholarship, right? Where you'll get these very careful explanations about how when you see people being brought before the Elohim, the gods, or when you have this divine council of the sons of the gods, that these are sets of human judges, that these are human figures, different ranks of human figures, rather than divine ones. Am I right? Do I understand that? Right? That's what's going on there.
Yeah, and that even gets to John's area. Where is it? John 10, where Jesus quotes Psalm 82. Is that right, John? About gods.
I do Luke Acts, Joe.
Wait. Where? Is there a Bible in the house?
Yeah, John 10, where Jesus quotes Psalm 82, and his interpretation, I think, is the judge's interpretation that he had received in Second Temple Judaism, if I'm remembering that correctly. So one fun thing about that to say, well, Jesus didn't quote Psalm 82 according to its original context, and that you can have fun with that one.
Right. Where does he do that in John?
He says, he says the Father and I are one, or something like that, and they respond to him angrily, of course. And at some point he says, the Scriptures say you are gods, something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
John 10, verse 34, Jesus answered, is it not written in your law? Oh my gosh, this is just the Gospel of John all over, isn't it? Your law. Not my law, says Jesus, right? This is your law. Is it not written? Wait, there's a footnote when it says your law. Other ancient authorities read in the law. Oh, this is super interesting, and we're only in the first few words. Jesus answered, is it not written in your law, I said you are gods. If those to whom the word of God came were called gods, and the scripture cannot be annulled, can you say that the one to whom So Jesus is, as you say, Joe, assuming here.
I'm depending for John to make sure we're right about that. But
right, that the
outside of his canon.
audience. So Jesus is assuming that the audience. So you've got God in Psalm 82 talking to these folks, and Jesus is assuming that God is talking to human people who receive the word of God. And these are the ones, because Psalm 82, God is taking down the other gods on account of social justice, right? They have not seen to the social and economic well-being of the people in their care. And so Jesus is apparently the interpretation in Jesus' circles, when Jesus went to synagogue, they were taught that God is addressing human rulers in there. That's it. Jesus said it. I believe it, and that settles it.
I've had some undergraduates tell me that.
Mm-hmm. All right, good. Oh gosh, we're past time. Sorry, guys. Anyone want to get anything off that's on your mind before we sign off?
When is John watching Noah? By what date?
When are you watching Noah, John? When can we get back? I mean, we want to be flexible with you. When can we get back to you on this?
At the next hangout, I'll give you guys a little movie review.
Okay.
I promise.
Where are folks
actually,
at?
I can't promise because I won't be here, but yeah, by the next time.
I am in the final 3 weeks of our academic term here. We've got this week, 2 more weeks, and then we're done. For those of you that are teaching currently, similar place, not similar place. What's your story?
Similar place.
Yeah.
May 9th is commencement.
Yeah.
May 9th is graduation.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have is anyone else counting down on their phones? Where's my T-minus app? There it is. T-minus, commencement. There we go.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
16 hours, 54 minutes, and 13 seconds until...
I don't need that app.
No, we all love teaching more than you do, Brooks, so we're not...
This is something I can work in all the enjoyment that I can in the meantime. I want to carpe the diem, every
That's what a T-minus app is for, bro.
Carpe
it's for carpe diem. Right.
All right, folks. Well, listen, I really appreciate you all joining. It's not a light thing for folks to take a little time out of your Thursdays when I know how much you all have to do and to join me here. I really enjoy having you here, and I'm glad that you decide to do it.
Glad I came.
What's that?
Glad I came.
Yeah, yay, Joe. Good to have you. Until next, and we'll see you again. I'm going to stop the broadcast, and then I'll say goodbye to these guys. So to everybody that watched, this was OOTLE15 Hangout on the Air. You can find the course at OOTLE15.net. And thank you very much for watching. Bye now.